it won't surprise anyone for me to hear me say that our constitution right now is an absolute mess. So we've had three prime ministers in 3 months, none of which, and those prime ministers have changed without there being a general election, without the electorate ever getting a say in the policy programme that they're putting forward. Boris Johnson's resignation on us is stuffing the House of Lords with yet more cronies, political advisors, unpleasant media editors. What do we need to do to fix our democratic mess that we're in right now?
Yeah, it can't be overspoken how bad things are right now. And in fact, in the short time that I've been deputy leader in these last couple of months, we've had three prime ministers and two monarchs. So things are certainly in flux right now. And also, I think whenever we speak out and say there should be a general election, and it's not right that Rishi Sunak should gain someone else's mandate and keep claiming he's going back to the original manifesto, so pretending Liz Truss disaster didn't even happen. People say, but we don't have a presidential system in this country, and actually there is no need for a general election. And to be fair, they're right if we're looking purely in terms of the rules. Yes, absolutely, they don't need to have a general election, and they could go until the very end. But you also have to have a moral and frankly ethical authority to govern. And I think that was lost in our first prime minister after, the first prime minister since the last election, which was Boris Johnson. It gets confusing with all these prime ministers. I think Liz Truss was clearly pushing it already in terms of that should never have really been allowed to happen, let alone the fact that she sent everything veering off a cliff. But even if she had carried on under Boris Johnson and carried on with kind of that ideology and program, there would have still been an argument that it wasn't right to keep doing that. But now that we've onto our third prime minister, there is just no acceptable or coherent form to say that they shouldn't now be going to the people to decide what to do. But in terms of your question, a lot of this more is about prevention, because we're in this situation where the Conservatives have a big majority. And frankly, we can shout general election as much as we want to. And I think it is important that we do, because I think after 12 years of the Tories, people frankly do want to see people on TV and radio and on their doorstep saying, yes, we agree, there should be a general election. But I think the fact that we know it's probably unlikely doesn't mean it should stop us doing it. But it does mean we need to coalesce, both as a green movement, but also with people that we share these values with, and have these important conversations about how do we make sure these things don't happen in the future. I think the most obvious priority is we need a written codified constitution. Whenever I say written constitution, pedants, and they're quite right, always say, no, we have written constitutions, but they're just not all in one place. So I think, that is a fair point. Codified constitution that's in one place and is very, very clear what the rules are. And I think that runs throughout politics, by the way. When I was elected to the London Assembly, which is by proportional representation, so there's a really good culture and atmosphere where you work with other parties, but there's often times where as a new assembly member you would come up to things and you would turn to secretariat, so they're a bit like the civil service, they're neutral, and say, what's the rule here, what do I have to do? And they kind of just shrug and they can tell you what convention has been, but convention is only convention until someone decides to change it, and hopefully they're changing it with goodwill for the better. But I don't think you should run a country like that, particularly when we've seen that often the Conservatives have not governed in good faith. So that's one thing, is a written codified constitution, so it's really clear everything that's happening. Then I think there's a whole conversation that needs to be had with the media. Now, this is a complicated conversation because as a party, we believe in the free press. We believe in the rights to be for people to be able to say what they want, as long as it's not hurting anyone and it's not trampling on anyone's rights. But at the same time, we have seen a Conservative government that has been far too cozy with the mainstream media in particular, and that is not the government's fault in some ways. Like, they shouldn't be doing that, but actually we should have a system where the media feel empowered to go, well, that's clearly not appropriate and we don't need to do that, and that's against the rules, so we're not going there. I think it's inevitable when you have some of these Conservative politicians in government that they will push it as far as they can, and ultimately you need the integrity of those journalists to be able to say no. It's a side issue, but it's really important to talk about, is local journalism. So that is massively being degraded. This is probably a good moment again, Chris, to plug Bright Green and the brilliant work you do. But actually lots of organisations that are doing similar work in different spaces that absolutely need people's support. And in fact, the BBC right now are facing huge cuts in their local radio services. And literally minutes before I came on air here, I just saw that some of their Afro-Caribbean local channels are also under threat as well. And essentially you need those local stations both geographically because they bring communities together, but also across ethnicity divides or sexuality or culturally. Those things are really important to bring people together, and ultimately if we just end up with homogenous national radio and national TV, that is not good for local democracy or good for communities. So that's really important too. And then finally, in this very long answer, I've left it till last, but of course we need proportional representation. I've left it till last because I talk about proportional representation all the time, and I think that's important. I think we're coming to a point where other people are now talking about proportional representation, so I'm starting to make the new point, which I've heard you made before, Chris, actually, when you did a really good lecture with the Young Greens, where you talk about democratic reform cannot just be proportional representation. It needs to be a whole host of things, and I agree. I used to say proportional representation is not a panacea, and then the brilliant Kleiner Jordan, who runs Make Votes Matter, said to me, stop saying it's not a panacea, because when do we ever say anything is a panacea? And I think that's quite true. Nothing in politics should ever be a panacea. So when people try and paint proportional representation as not being a panacea, it's kind of a ridiculous argument, because nothing in and of itself is ever going to be the thing that solves everything. But I do think it's fair to say that with the barrier of an unfair electoral system, things will never change sustainably. So actually, we need to get that electoral system fixed. So then we can look at the codified constitution, a different relationship with the media, the way that we fund political parties, the way that people are allowed to lobby, the way things campaign. There's a whole host of issues. Rallying against voter ID, then we're into public order and policing protest. All of those things are vitally important things that often get missed. But I think the big barrier to all of them right now is the first past the post broken voting system.
So you're right. Whenever I talk to anyone about proportional representation, I always want to move the conversation slightly broader than that one issue, and that's what I'm going to hopefully do now. So beyond the setup in Westminster, the electoral system, how Westminster and Parliament works, what do you think a good, effective, genuinely democratic system of governance in the UK would look like?
So I think a lot of it is about politicians in power being willing to share that power and redistribute it in the same way that we should be redistributing wealth and income. So to give a very specific example, actually, is my relationship with London Mayor Sadiq Khan. Now, I'm always careful when I talk about the mayor not to be unconstructive or needlessly critical. And I would say being a critical friend is absolutely something that we've looked to do along with Sean and Caroline to build those constructive relationships. And we've really seen that be reciprocated. So there's plenty of time where the mayor has credited the Greens with ideas and often gives us meetings where we meet with some of his top policy advisors to talk about how we can navigate things. And frankly, I'd like to see more Greens in the London Assembly, as I'd like to see them in councils and nationally. And I'd also like to see a Green mayor. But if, aside from that, the thing that we're doing is seeing green policies be implemented and make millions of people's lives better, then that clearly has to be the point of all of this too. So I think it's always important to work with people constructively. But the very first time I was ever able to challenge him in Mayor's Question Time and ask him about anything, I asked him about citizens' assemblies. So bringing the public's voice into the chamber. And the answer he gave me was really telling. He said that I was in danger of making myself redundant. And I think this is a real difference between the Green Party and some of Labour. Some of Labour get our kind of values, but I think the top of Labour, particularly at the moment, don't. And it's that real top-down authoritarian kind of, we have the answers, and if we can just implement them, then everyone's lives will be better. Whereas we believe in a much more community, grassroots way of decision making. Now, anyone who's in the Green Party knows that that can be chaotic and it can be slow sometimes. And I think within that, you need to make sure you have red lines to make sure that the most vulnerable people in the conversation are always protected. And of course, I'm referring there in particular to making sure we're defending trans people in the party and their identity. But I think on most issues, a healthy debate in a democratic way where everyone gets to put their voices forward and things are voted on is a really good way of doing democracy. And I think we need to see more of that, both at national politics and at local politics of citizens' assemblies. And then there's a slightly different thing too that I'm pushing in London at the moment, which is something called the London Climate Panel. Now, the mayor's really good at working with big organizations like Greenpeace or Friends of the Earth, and I applaud that. I'm not saying any different. It's really good that he's working with climate organizations. But what he often misses, and I see mayors all over the UK and council leaders doing this too, is they often miss those hyper local groups because they just don't feel important enough or they don't have access to the same representation. So they kind of get missed in the mix. I'm talking about groups that are trying to save a tree at the end of their road, or they're looking at an abandoned building that's in the area that shouldn't be knocked down, but could actually be turned into a community space. And I said, I'd really like to see these groups, particularly ones that are from working class backgrounds or people of colour, being given a platform on a panel where they're able to make recommendations to me as chair of the Environment Committee, or ideally even to the mayor. So to be able to directly speak to him and say, these are the things we would like in our communities. The mayor was pretty warm about this until I made a vital point that these people should be compensated for their time and labor. It doesn't seem right that you would take people who are struggling to feed their kids or heat their homes and say, we need all your lived experience, all your trauma, all the problems that you've had. We're going to take all that expertise, but we're not going to recompensate you. We're just going to make everyone else's lives better. And he said to me that I shouldn't knock good citizenship, and that all over our city you had scout leaders and boxing coaches working for free. Now that's undoubtedly true, but it really rings of David Cameron's Big Society, which wasn't a bad idea in and of itself. But when you're doing it as a cover for austerity, then it clearly is a huge issue. So to wind back to the beginning of the question, I think there's clearly something to be done here between the relationship between citizenship, who volunteers, but actually how do we make sure that everyone is involved with that and people aren't volunteering who can't afford to, but actually we're turning those things into jobs and that people are being recompensated and that actually we have useful jobs that serve the society. Care workers are a very often obvious example of that, where it's something that's often been done free, often by women in the family, but not always. And so sometimes it is less valued than, very much in inverted commas, a proper job. And actually I think there's a whole conversation there about making sure we're valuing everyone's work and everyone's contribution to society. So to finish off, a proper democracy would look like where everyone's value is contributed, everyone has a voice at the table, everyone has a stake. And also we still want politicians to represent people, so I'm not doing away with politicians, but those people need to be able to be held accountable, and we need to end the culture of safe seats.
So I'm going to get some questions from the chat in a moment, and one thing you mentioned there was citizens' assemblies, and I can see there's some questions come in on that specific issue. But before we do that, I've got one final question for you from me, which is you've talked quite eloquently there about the kind of vision for a new democracy, the critique of the current constitutional settlement, and I think a lot of people watching this will be thinking, well, that's all well and good, but one of the problems with the campaign for political reform is that the very people that we are asking to deliver it are the ones that currently benefit from the status quo. So the Tories obviously massively benefit from the first past the post electoral system. They benefit from the House of Lords. They benefit from our current centralised. I mean, I think it's the most centralised democracy in Europe. The Tories could very clearly benefit from that. Realistically, we're not going to get any meaningful democratic reform out of the Tories. The Labour Party also significantly benefit from the status quo. The first past the post system maintains them as one of two parties of power. Even though at the moment it appears to be slightly rigged against them, nonetheless, it still significantly benefits them relative to other parties. But also, it maintains that party's grip on power, and it maintains the political contradictions that are within the Labour Party, and you don't get, for example, a political party of the left in the Labour tradition outside of what is now the Labour Party. So it doesn't make any sense in any real world for the likes of Jeremy Corbyn and John McDonnell to be in the same political party as Wes Streeting, and yet they are, and that's maintained by our current democratic setup. And so I guess the point I'm trying to get to really is, you know, we're not going to get democratic reform anytime soon from the Tories, and it looks unlikely that we're going to get meaningful democratic reform from the Labour Party because they are the two primary beneficiaries of the current status quo. So what's the strategy there? How do we ensure that the next Labour government, or even if you think it's possible, the Tory government, to introduce meaningful political reform and start to move towards the kind of democratic setup that you want to see?
Yeah, so I winced a little bit because I don't think it's going to come from the Tory government. And I think that I just had a pause where I thought, well, actually, maybe if we do have another Tory government, we've got to think, how do we get to that? But I think, if we have another Tory government, apart from the chaos and the absolute devastation that will cause for so many of the most vulnerable people in society, I also think that will push political or democratic reform further down the road as well. And that's something we can't afford. I think I've got two caveats before I answer the question. One is, I think it was fair to say that we would talk to Labour tomorrow morning if they wanted to talk to us. So something I hear frequently, but particularly since I become deputy leader and I go in certain spaces, is why are you not talking to the Labour Party? Why are you not trying to reach out to Keir Starmer? And why did Caroline Lucas shun the previous Labour leader. And I think the important thing to say is none of those things are true. So Caroline Lucas in particular wrote to Jeremy Corbyn several times and tried to reach out. And I don't think it's any secret that we shared more in common with Jeremy Corbyn as Labour leader than we did with Keir Starmer. But actually, both Labour leaders have suffered from what I would say is a culture of Labourism. So I'm not equating the two people. They're clearly two very different politicians with different ways of working. But I think they both share in common that feeling that the only answer to all of our problems is a Labour government. And I think that's been incredibly damaging to the general left, but actually to politics and to society. And I think it's been damaging to Conservatives too, because the current system means that people who are in parties together should not be in parties together. And I'm always in danger of or always cautious about praising previous Conservative MPs, because I think it's very easy to make them sound like Anna Soubry was fine, and she wasn't, for instance. There were lots of things wrong with Anna Soubry and a lot of the MPs that left, and Ken Clarke. But actually, I think it is fair to say they were better than the current group that we have. And what first past the post meant is that all of those people had to exit the party, and we've ended up with this party that's lurched even further to the right because they literally couldn't be in the same party anymore. And I see that happening in Labour Party. I do think it's quite weird to think of the examples you gave, Jeremy Corbyn and Wes Streeting, although of course Jeremy Corbyn isn't in the party at the moment, but John McDonnell and Wes Streeting, for instance, being in the party together. Like, genuinely, what do those people share in common other than not wanting a Tory government? You could go very easily into a policy, and after a couple of sentences, you would see very different views on how to do things. And the second caveat I want to give, and I'm obligated to give this one, but it is true, is Carla Denyer did a brilliant interview this weekend with Nick Robinson, Political Thinking. I'd encourage anyone to watch it. And Nick Robinson, I would say almost snooty question was, well, you're not going to win under the current system, so how, what is the plan? And Carla immediately interrupted him and said, well, I totally disagree with that. And actually, in places like Bristol West, that will be Bristol Central once the boundaries have changed, there are genuine opportunities for us to win even under the first past the post system. Is that easy? Absolutely not. There's a huge amount of work to be done, and I would encourage everyone who can do to get to Bristol and help support Carla's campaign there. But I'm always careful when talking about proportional representation to point out, of course, the breakthrough that we've had at local levels too, where we're winning council seats even under first past the post system, shows we can and do win. It's just particularly unfair, and we have to work, significantly harder. So to answer the question though, what do we do about a Labour Party that just doesn't want to cooperate? Well, I think the first thing is we keep having to take the high ground and the moral high ground, which is why I started by saying we do want to talk to the Labour Party. I don't think that ever gets to a point where we say we would never talk to Labour, we would never work with Labour. I think we need to keep that door open and recognise that after 12 years of a Tory government, people are really feeling it. And I'm talking about people who aren't involved with political parties, but actually they don't even consider themselves particularly political, but they just absolutely want rid of this government and their cruel and callous ways, and their treatment of refugees just being the first example that comes to mind. So I think we need to recognize that people are feeling that. And as much as I talk about proportional representation and democratic reform, I do recognize that is a different conversation to what people are viscerally feeling when they need food on the table. But of course, the link there is strong, and that's the link I'm constantly making. So I think that's the first thing, is to make sure we keep a high ground and always say that we are willing to talk to people within reason, of course, and that, for any negotiations, proportional representation would have to be a red line on that. I think the second thing is to keep working with politicians and recognise people can change their mind. And I've seen Labour MPs in the last couple of years go from significantly anti some of these reforms to saying, yes, I actively support it, to being someone who is signed up and campaigning for it. Not proportional representation, but to give an example of universal basic income, I've been in meetings recently with Andy Burnham, who is the mayor of Manchester, who is being brilliant on universal basic income. And there's no other way of describing that. I don't think there's any need to score political points on that. He is speaking loudly and clearly and making good arguments for why the universal credit system isn't working, why it's dehumanizing, and why making sure that we have a universal basic income that protects people, particularly people on disabilities, people with disabilities, all of those important points is telling the narrative in the right way that it needs to be told. And I think we need to recognize we never have a monopoly on truth or the good, the right policies. So I think every individual person in their constituency continually writing and lobbying their politician, especially if they're from the Labour Party, is a really important part of that, especially now that Labour have backed PR. And then I think the biggest thing, and I don't like giving this answer, but it's the true, is it's a little bit of a roll of the dice. So for me, the worst outcome of the next election, unsurprisingly, would be a Tory government. But the next kind of scenario that I don't particularly want is a big Labour government, because we know that they would not listen to people. We know that particularly under Keir Starmer, they would be very happy to lean to the right and just to get things done. But I think if they don't have that huge majority, they're already going to be thinking about the next election, and they're already going to be thinking about the fact that there is this rising movement of democratic reform. So I think we essentially need to be ready for that moment to make sure that we're pushing a Labour government, which would hopefully be in coalition, or a Labour minority government, into the right direction. I think that's a really exciting space again for the Greens. We see time and time again on councils where we're not in power, but we're in opposition, how we are the voices in the room that are demonstrating the difference that makes. And I think we would need to do that at a national level too, whether we had 2, 3, 5 MPs. I think it would be a really important role those MPs would play in informing that national conversation. I don't think that should be underestimated. Sorry, that was a very long answer, but it was a big question.
Yeah, thank you so much, Zach. So we're running a little over time, but if it's okay with you and you've got an extra 5 minutes, I might just take one or two questions from the chat. Brilliant. So please do stick any questions that you have for Zach in the chat, and we'll try and take them. And the first is from Ben Samuel. So Ben asks, "What is the Green Party view on citizens' assemblies?"
So we're pro citizens assemblies, I believe. We want people to come together and have those discussions. I think the caveat I always put in, and this is just because the media go, well, why have politicians then? Let's just get rid of politicians. There's a really important moment where you both need experts in terms of scientific detail and in terms of analyzing things and presenting arguments. And there's no reason why a layperson shouldn't be able to listen to those arguments and make really informed decisions. I do think there's a point though where it's unrealistic to expect people to do that on every single issue ever and be constantly giving that their time to do that. So a politician, in terms of their most fundamental duty, which is to represent what the people want, I think is still a role that is really important in our society. So we support citizens' assemblies. I put the caveat in there that it should always come back to politicians in order to enact the guidance that citizens make. But I think ultimately we believe that power should be at the most local level it can ever be. And that's why we constantly talk about the importance of local councils too. And actually, I think it's always important to point out that extra cash for local councils is really important. And I think it's worth calling for. But the bigger thing to call for, I think, is for local councils to have the ability to generate their own cash. Because otherwise we're constantly in this kind of hand-me-down culture from government where they have to go with a begging bowl, whereas actually I think councils should be able to generate that revenue. I think we need to be careful with that because I think it increasingly looks like if the government starts to say to councils, you control your own council tax in this area, and then they start to punish local councils because they've not raised their tax enough, but not fund them in other places, and that's a cover for austerity. That is clearly messy. But the general principle that we should be giving more power to local councils, I think, is an important one, and citizens' assemblies is a natural extension of that because power is going to the most local level it can.
Brilliant, thank you, Zach. So, one last question for you. So, Philip Davis says that the current Green Party policy on the head of state needs to be rewritten, as currently it would hand the head of state role over to the Speaker of the House of Commons. So, firstly, do you agree that the current party policy needs to be rewritten? And secondly, what would be your preference for electing an elected head of state?
I do think it needs to be rewritten. I think we're in a different time now where there's a different moment where these conversations feel more possible than maybe they were for obvious reasons. This is going to sound like a get out, but it is true. I'm almost proposing a citizens' assembly on this in terms of it would be good to get a group of people together to go, actually, what is the best policy here? And I could generate a few ideas. So this isn't avoiding the question, but I think ultimately it's something where I would have a very London-centric focus on this, and I would want to hear what people in other places think. I think of places like Gloucestershire, for instance, that would be very monarchy heavy. I'm not talking about Green Party members there, but talking about members there generally who would probably want it to look like one thing, and then you've got places in urban areas that would probably want to see another thing. And I think it would just be important actually, then rather than going, this is what I think and this is what we should do, we brought people together from different regions and different areas, and of course Wales as well being its own separate country, to say how do you want to feed in on this too, and working with our party in Scotland too. So I think that's a really important conversation to have. I agree that it does need to be rewritten. I think it's now out of date considering the very pronounced changed circumstances, to for want of a better metaphor. And yeah, I think it's time to get together and create a better policy there. I think the one we have, it just isn't. I think if the media got hold of that in a kind of long-term way, I think there's holes there in ways that we don't have with other policies. And I think one thing I'm proud of with as a party, we always want watertight policy.
Thank you so much, Zach, for joining us this evening. It's been an absolute pleasure as always. It's been a brilliant, fascinating conversation, and thank you for joining us.
I've loved being on episode 1, and I can compliment you again now without sounding like I just want an easy interview. Well done again.